Boker Tov, good morning everyone, and a Shavua Tov. Please got a good week ahead. We are now live on Facebook and on YouTube for another session of daily learning and lockdown inspiration. So I see people are logging on now, and if you're just logging on, I want to welcome you back to a brand new week. It's a new week. It was our 20th parasha under lockdown. 20th parasha under lockdown. But yet here we are. We're still learning. We're still engaging. And we're inspiring one another. So I see people are logging on as we speak. Thanks for joining on Facebook and YouTube. I'm going to welcome you in just a moment personally to today's session. I can already see that some people on Facebook have really liked this video. Well done. So like it again for those who haven't, and share it to the bottom of the page, so that way others can benefit from it as well. Right. So let's welcome all those who have greeted us morning on the Facebook chat. Linda, Hami, Drew, Arnold, Orkin, Boker Tov, and Hack. Good morning. Good morning, Helen Feinstein, Tracy Mindel, Shavua Tov, Aline Udolovitz, Michael Stein, Larry Cohen. Good morning. Good to see you all. And on YouTube, we have Stan and Raylene Brask, Sherilyn Diamond, Shulamit Schultz, Vega Sega, Manfred Kalmek, Lionel and Louise Rubin. Good morning, David Seif, Ronnie Kotkas and Eleanor. Dennis Solomons, good morning, good morning. Great. So we're going to give it 30 more seconds just to allow for others to log on. And then we are going to get going. All right, good. Maureen and Robert Levy, good morning. Yesterday, in the parasha of the week, Parashat Ve'etchanan, it was an action-packed week, and I wanted to touch upon something that caught my attention, and I wanted to share it with all of you today. Hi, Daryl and Shelley Smith. Good morning, Stephen Herr. Yes, we'll dedicate our learning to Esther Bat Moshe. Thank you for joining this morning. So, the topic yesterday that caught my attention was Ir Miklat. What is it, Ir Miklat? An Ir Miklat is a city of refuge. And the Torah tells us that if somebody murders or kills his friend, not murder, he kills his friend accidentally, without intention, then they must run to a city of refuge, to the Ir Miklat, and that's where they're going to be kept safe from the hands of the family who are looking to avenge the killing of their relative. And they must remain there until the Kohen Gadol passes on. That's the law. In other words, if he doesn't go there, Shalom Trigo, good morning. Marlene Sher, good morning. Felicia Chanks, Boker Tov. If he doesn't go, if the killer the accidental killer, doesn't go to the city of refuge, then the family of the deceased have the right to avenge his blood and to kill the killer. That's the halacha. He has to run away to a city of refuge, to the Ir Miklat, and in the Ir Miklat is where he's going to be kept safe. That's the halacha. That's the rule. And he must remain there. Now, the law, Jewish law teaches us something very, very interesting. While he's done something wrong and he needs to run to exile, by the way, going to exile wasn't just escaping the hands of the family members. Going to exile was, in fact, a process of kapara, of atonement as well for this individual. By going to exile, he was atoning for what he had done wrong. It was part of the kapara, as we call it, part of the atonement process. Now, when he goes into exile, we as a community, or as a Beth Din, have the responsibility of making sure that he has everything he needs in exile where he is. The Gemara tells us we're going to make sure there's a source of water supply. We're going to make sure there's a source of food. There should be a shuk or a marketplace where he is in exile. Because to send him out to exile with nothing there, that's not responsible of us. He's not a murderer. He's killed someone by accident and needs to run into exile. And we've got to make sure that he has everything he needs. Stan Brask says correctly, that's where modern day Israel gets its word from. The shelter or the safe room in a home in Israel is also called a miklat. Exactly. So I've been into a miklat. I was a child in Israel during the Gulf War. And every time the sirens would go off because missiles were landing from Iraq, we ran into the miklat. Right. The miklat is like the building, is the hideout, the bunker within a building. Every room has a cheder atum, which is the sealed off room in every house in Israel. But that's where it gets it from, right? Ir Miklat, city of refuge. Miklat is where you run to when you hear sirens, God forbid, of missiles arriving into Israel. Now, in the Miklat, we had to make sure that they had everything they needed. Water supply, food supply. That was our responsibility to provide for them. Now, what's amazing and what caught my attention that I wanted to share with you, how did they determine if the murder was done by accident? Very good question, Stephen. It's a very good question. The Beth Din were the ones to determine that. And if it was done accidentally, if it was done purposely, then he was punished appropriately. And if it was done accidentally, then he had to run off to the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge. Now, one thing, should I say, that they had to arrange for him, which is quite interesting, is the following. It says that if a student went into exile, then we send his teacher in exile with him. Can you imagine? One of the students went into exile for doing wrong. Halacha is that we can't leave him there on his own without being able to study Torah. So therefore we take his Rav, we take his teacher, and we send his teacher into exile, into Golos too, to be there with him and to learn with him. Because the responsibility is to give him everything that he needs for living life. And learning Torah is one of those things that he needs in order to live life. And so we send his teacher in after him. His teacher must go to exile, to Golos too, to be with him. It's unbelievable. What an interesting halacha. And we're going to take the teacher, the rabbi. Now, what about all the other students that the rabbi is responsible for back at town? The rabbi is responsible for his own students back at home. How can he leave them? My understanding is that back in the city, back at home, he can find a locum quite easily. But in exile, where the student is, no locum is driving out into exile to learn with the students. So he's going to bring a locum in to teach his students locally. And he's going to go out into Golos, into exile, to learn with his students. Now, I reckon that in today's times, with lockdown, or with technology, as we're experiencing in lockdown, it's a whole different ballgame. Because you could be sitting in Timbuktu. As long as I make time, I can learn with you. We learn every day like this. We've got over 30, close to 30 viewers online right now, and we're not in one venue. So I think that with today's technology, the laws of teaching, the laws of a Rav following his students, the Rav going into exile for the sake of his student, is going to change in today's times. Because we don't need to be there physically. He'll pull out his Zoom, I'll pull out my Zoom, or Facebook or YouTube, whatever other platform we're going to use, and we can learn together. I can teach my students in Joburg and my students in Cape Town, my students in Australia, all together. That's the unique world we live in. Once upon a time, you had to have your teacher next to you. And if he wasn't there, then you had to find another teacher, because who else are we going to learn with? In today's world, there's a whole different ballgame. It's completely different. We can have students wherever we are and in multiple places at the same time. It's phenomenal. That being said, I want to welcome everybody who's online with us. And if anybody is from out of town, let us know you're here, either national or international. We always like to engage with everyone. Hi, Sydney Lazarus. Boker Tov. Thanks for joining, Sydney. Talking about national learning. So, Sydney, you've made us national now. With the help of technology, we're able to learn with Johannesburg and Durban at the same time. That's the case in study right now with the Talmud, the student who's exiled into the Ir Miklat, the city of refuge. They didn't have a Facebook platform in those days. David Seif on YouTube asks, is the halacha still in force? And what are the cities of Ir Miklat? No, we don't have an Ir Miklat anymore. David, this only applies, I think it only applies at a time when we have the temples and the Sanhedrin. We don't have that anymore, and therefore we don't have cities of refuge anymore. Hi, Selwyn Lichtenstein. Good morning. Shalom Trigo. Jews are not permitted to take revenge. Very good question. Jews are not permitted to take revenge. So your question is, why are we letting the family of the murdered, of the deceased, why are we letting them take revenge against the killer? Jews are not allowed to take revenge. Very good question. We'll have to come back to you on that one, actually. That's a great question. Thank you for sharing. It would be easy for me to say that it's a Gezerat HaKatuv, meaning that's the decree of God. And that's the way it is. And maybe it's set up in such a way to force him to go to exile. In other words, if you don't go to exile, they can kill you. You better run to exile. it's not a sufficient answer to your question. What happened to the It says we also don't have cities on the east side of the Jordan. That's right. That's a good well, Stanley, is that Moshe Rabbeinu was told that the cities of refuge in Israel will only work if the cities of refuge on the east side, in other words, three and three. Three on the east side of the Jordan, three on the west side of the Jordan inside Israel. And today we don't have those cities on the east side of the Jordan. Therefore, the cities in Israel also can't work because the cities of refuge work in unison. And if you're missing the cities in the Jordanian side, on the east side of the Jordan, then you can't have your cities on the west side in the Israel either. That's Stanley's point, I think. Thank you, Stanley. So the question now is, which I want to unpack with you. The question is, why should the teacher suffer? It's not fair to the teacher. The student has been sent into exile for doing something wrong. But why is the teacher having to go? What did the teacher do wrong? Why should the teacher have to go into exile? So there are different responses to answer this. I want to share with you the Rambam's response. I want to share with you the Rambam's response. The Rambam Maimonides says, I'll tell you why the teacher goes into exile. Let me tell you why. The Rambam says like this. Baalei Chachma, those who own wisdom. Baalei Chachma, those who own wisdom. Umevaksheha, and those who seek wisdom. So those who own wisdom and those who seek wisdom, without learning Torah, they are considered dead. Without learning Torah, they are considered dead. The Rambam says that those who are involved in Torah learning, without it, are considered dead. So it now becomes a matter of life and death, where this guy goes into exile. It's like food. You got to provide food. If you don't provide food, he's going to die. It's a matter of life and death. Similarly, you got to provide Torah learning, because if you don't offer Torah learning, they're going to die. And therefore, the Rav, the teacher, has to go into exile with them. Because if you don't send the teacher there to learn with him, who's going to learn with him? What's he going to learn? He's not going to have Torah, so he dies. So out of pikuach nefesh, out of saving his life and protecting his life, we send the Rav. We inconvenience the Rav to go out into exile to be with the students. It reminds me of Rabbi Akiva's story. Rabbi Akiva was living in Israel during the Roman control over Israel. And the Romans made a rule that you can't teach Torah. You can't have yeshivot, you can't have cheders, you can't have students, you can't teach. And Rabbi Akiva disregarded the instruction of the Romans. And he nonetheless hosted classes, Torah classes. And some of his peers, some of his contemporaries approached Rabbi Akiva and said, what are you doing? You're putting yourself into danger. Not just you into danger, but your students into danger too. How could you do this? And Rabbi Akiva said like this: what are my options? If I'm like a fish, he used the analogy of the fish in the water. Look at the fish in the water. If you take the fish out of the water, the analogy was that the fox came to the fish. And the fox said, fish, fish, what are you doing in the water? The fishermen are going to catch you and eat you. You better get out of the water. Come. The fox was a clever, smart aleck. He says to the fish, come out of the water. He wanted to eat. He says, if you stay in the water, the fishermen are going to catch you. So come out of the water. So the fish says to the fox like this: if I come out of the water, I'm going to die immediately. The issue wasn't the fox eating the fish. Let me correct that. He was foolishly advising the fish. The fish says, if I'm going to come out of the water, I'm for sure going to die. If I'm going to stay in the water, not necessarily will the fisherman catch me. And therefore, I'm going to stay in the water because I don't want to die. So I'll stay in the water and hopefully the fisherman won't catch me. Rabbi Akiva said the same thing applies to him learning and teaching Torah. He says, if I close my book and I don't learn Torah, I don't teach Torah, we're going to die because us without Torah, we're like dead. If I continue learning Torah, they may not catch me or they may yes catch me. I don't know. It's called Bori V'Shema. Are you sure or you're unsure? So he says, I'd rather do what I'm sure of. I'd rather learn Torah. That way I'll stay safe. And who knows if they catch me or they don't catch me. So too over here we see by the students, the Talmud. The Talmud who goes into exile, into Golos, he has to learn. If he doesn't learn, he's like dead. So that's why the halacha is send the teacher into exile with him. As inconvenient as that may be for the teacher, you send the teacher in order to make sure that the student has Torah, in order to make sure that the student stays alive. And in fact, Shlomo HaMelech says it clearly in the pasuk. Shlomo HaMelech says, "Ha-chochma techaya ba'aleha," that the wisdom keeps the owners alive. That what makes a person alive, it's the chochma, it's the wisdom. That's why we're all here again on a Sunday morning. It happens to be Sunday morning, but that's why we're here again. Why are we here? Because we know what keeps us alive is the Torah learning. It's the 10:30 a.m. YouTube or Facebook Torah learning. That's why we're online right now. All 35 of us. Thank you for joining. Ha-chochma techaya ba'aleha, the wisdom gives us life. The question is, hi, Dawn Olovitz, good morning. The question is, the Rambam's terminology is very interesting. When you look in the Rambam, because the Rambam is a source of halacha, right, Maimonides. And Maimonides records this halacha, and he says a very interesting terminology. He says, Baalei Chachma u'mevaksheha. Those who are the owners of Chachma, u'mevaksheha, and those who seek Chachma. What's up with that Rambam's terminology? That sounds very exclusive. Baalei Chachma. Who are these people of Chachma? Baalei Chachma u'mevaksheha. Those who are the owners of Chachma and the seekers of Chachma, they're the ones who we can say about them that without Torah learning, it's as if they're dead. Shalom Shriga asks the question, but I'll come back to the Rambam's terminology in a moment. Shalom Shriga's question is, couldn't Leviim teach this person? In other words, the Leviim were in the cities of refuge. So the Leviim could have taught this person. Shalom, I don't know if we can force the Leviim to do this. It's not really their job to become teachers of the refugees running to the Ir Miklat. It's a nice idea in theory, but I don't know if we can force the Leviim. The Torah did not force the Leviim. The Torah did not force the Leviim to become teachers suddenly, because there are now refugees there who are seeking safety. It's his Rav in particular. I want to end with this question. Okay? The Rambam is describing Baalei Chochma U'Mevaksheha. The Rambam is describing these wise people and these seekers of wisdom, that for them Torah learning is part of life and death. The irony is, who are these killers? What level of spirituality are the killers on? The Talmud tells us that God does not bring such a disastrous, tragic event of killing someone accidentally. The Talmud tells us God does not bring that to every random individual. You don't just end up in such a position. The Rambam tells us something very interesting. The Rambam says that you only end up doing that is because you were guilty yourself for something, and you needed to get to exile, and God had to find a way how to get you to exile. So he coordinated in such a way that you were climbing the ladder. God forbid, not you or not me. He was climbing the ladder. He fell off the ladder accidentally. He killed his friend. Everyone saw it, and now he has to run to exile. So the Talmud tells us, who is this killer? He's not the righteous of the town. He's not the Baalei Chochma either. He's not the wise ones. He is actually what we call the mischievous students. He's the mischievous student that needed a punishment, and God had to find a way how to punish him. Otherwise, no one saw his previous acts, and nobody could bring him to court or bring him to Beis Din. So he had to go through this process of accidental murder in order to get thrown into exile. So we're not talking about anybody very wise or very holy. We're talking about a very regular, mundane individual. The Talmud describes him as a Talmid she'eino hagun. He's not an appropriate level student. He's a mischievous type of student. He's the one that gets put into this situation. And he's the one that goes into exile. So the question is, how does the halacha and the reason match up? The halacha says that he goes into exile and we have to send his teacher there with him. Who are we talking about? We're talking about a guy who's mischievous. He's naughty. And God needs to find a way how to send him into exile, so he causes him to kill accidentally, and he goes into exile, and we send his teacher out with him. And what's the reason? Why do you send the student out? The Rambam says, because Baalei Chochma U'Mevaksheha, those who seek wisdom and are wise, it's as if they're dead if they don't have Torah learning. But that's not the guy we're talking about here. We're not talking about the Baalei Chochma. We're not talking about the wise crack. We're not talking about the wise guy. We're talking about the lower level of society who end up doing acts of murder. We're not talking about Baalei Chochma U'Mevaksheha, those who seek wisdom, those who are men of wisdom. So that's the question I want to leave you with. You got to come back tomorrow to hear the answer of how to reconcile the halacha of the Rambam together with the reason of the Rambam. What level or category of society are we talking about over here? Are we talking about the elite, the exclusive group of wise students who for them Torah is like life? Or are we talking about the average type of guy? Just on that note, there's something very interesting here. You're driving down the road, which is a side detail here. You're driving down the road, not you and not me. Someone's driving down the road, and God forbid someone comes and hits them in the middle, hits their car, and there's a crash and a smash of two cars. Do you know there's a story about each one? Why did they smash into my car? I've got to ask myself that question. What did God want from me? Why was I the one right there at that time? They can ask the same question. Why did that happen to me? Why didn't I see the red light? Why wasn't I concentrating and I therefore hit the other car? Both parties have to ask the same question. You know, so often what happens after a crash is that both parties get out and they start yelling and shouting at each other. You hit me, you hit me. Why didn't you look? You should have seen. Guys, just look upwards. There's a creator in the world. Make sure he's part of the conversation. Yes, you can be frustrated and upset at the other guy. That's okay. But look upwards. God coordinates things in very strange ways. And it was supposed to happen this way. Your car was supposed to get hit, and you were destined to be the driver to hit him. Doesn't mean we're not guilty. Doesn't mean we're not responsible for our actions. It just means that God coordinates things in interesting ways. But we're running out of time for today, so you're going to have to come back tomorrow to understand this story of the students. Who is this student that we're sending his teacher after? Is it the wise men of the community? Or is it the lower end of the inappropriate, mischievous, naughty students that we're talking about, that their teacher goes out to learn with them? That's the question. Please come back tomorrow. Same time, 10:30 a.m. on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll come join us and be part of this conversation. Thank you for your questions, Shalom Trige in particular. Shalom had some good questions today, so thank you for those. In the meantime, I'm going to wish you a wonderful day ahead and say, keep safe, keep sane, keep strong, and keep spiritual. Have a wonderful day ahead.